So we have an esteemed panel here today that is going to take us through this. And it looks like we all got the memo that it was dark blue suit day today, too, so that's good. We try to coordinate to every detail in this conference, as you've noticed. And the only thing we haven't done is match ties, but we'll get that right next year. So as I was saying, it just kind of is the panel is getting organized. This is a discussion kind of big vision, and I know there's a light behind me, so you don't have to stare at me as I'm talking to you. I'll move over a little bit here. Maybe that helps, maybe that doesn't. I don't know. We're at a point today that on a global scale of emissions in somewhere 36 billion metric tons. And the projections indicate that by 2050, in the absence of action, we would be at 50 billion tons. And scientists tell us to actually achieve our goals for mitigating the worst impacts of climate change, that we need to be down to 15. So essentially what we're saying is that we need to reduce all of the emissions that we have today and only have growth between now and 2050. And that's an incredible, incredible challenge. And in that time, of course, we know that the world economy is due to probably triple from the $90 trillion today to something like $280 trillion. That world population is going to grow. We're at something in the order of 6 to 7 million people today. We're going to be at 9 billion people by 2050. And that is daunting. I mean, just to lay it out in that way, to say we're going to grow the economy worldwide by 3, we're going to increase population by 2.5 billion people, and we're going to essentially reduce all the emissions that we have today, and we're only going to have new emissions growth, and we're going to be at 15 billion metric tons by 2050. Is that achievable? Is that real? And so what we're going to talk about here is exactly that question and how we get there. And I want to start with Peter Lehner, the executive director from the NRDC, whom you've heard from yesterday. And yesterday, Peter talked about the agricultural sector and the major contributions in food production in the agricultural sector and the need to acknowledge that source. But I think, looking at perhaps borrowing a phrase from the energy discussions that we have going on today, to get to the kinds of emission reductions that we really need. We need an all-of-the-above strategy, right? We need energy, and we need transportation, and we need agriculture, and we need deforestation to be addressed, and all those other things. So I guess the question for you, Peter, to start us off, is do you think it's possible? And if so, how are we going to do it?
Well, I sort of start from the premise that it has to be possible. Although it's a tremendous challenge. The consequences of not succeeding are going to be more and more visible every day. We saw the Year of Living Dangerously movie yesterday. There's a big report coming out that will be called Risky Business, which will be done by Tom Steyer, Mike Bloomberg, and Hank Paulson, and R&D and an independent, that will try to make crystal clear that the cost of doing nothing is vastly greater than the cost of moving to a clean energy and more efficient economy. And that's the challenge. So I think that is on the one hand. The other hand is we have a lot of technologies that are out there right now that can get us a lot of the way. We have proven policies that have made tremendous improvements, including changing how we bill our utilities so that utilities become players in the efficiency effort, renewable portfolio standards, and of course the whole AB 32, and equivalent or similar efforts like RGGI in other states. So we have a lot of policy tools that we know can work. The challenge is, do we have the political will to do it at the scale that is really necessary? And by we, at this point, I'm really just talking as the question is mostly focused on California. You have to think, California, there's the United States, and then there's the whole world. Yeah. And each of these issues are different, but in some ways similar in all of these areas. I think back a little bit, the hopeful side of me thinks back to the area near where I grew up, outside of Boston. The Quincy shipyard started off at the beginning of World War II being a sort of a shipyard producing a big ship every once or twice a year. And by the height of World War II, it was producing a Liberty ship every day. The scale up that we were able to achieve, and one reads about, is extraordinary. It's orders of magnitude larger than anything that we have seen. And there, obviously, we had tremendous political will to make that happen. So for me, a lot of the question of plausibility comes down to one of political will. It's not, the economics are clearly on our side. The reality of science is on our side. Technology is there. The question is, do we have the political will? And the challenge is, frankly, that a clean energy world and a more efficient world that addresses climate change benefits virtually everybody except those that produce dirty fuels. And right now, those folks are pretty politically powerful and are flexing their political muscles. So that's going to be the challenge. I like to think that we can address the political challenge, but it's not going to be easy.
Absolutely. I've got several questions, I think, in follow-up to that, but I want to first kind of allow all of our panelists here to kind of make some opening remarks on this topic. And I think I'll if I may, move on to Rodolfo Lacy, who's the Undersecretary for Policy and Planning at Mexico's Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources. Also glad to have him as a member of my board of directors at the Climate Action Reserve. So, Rodolfo, tell me, Mexico has had this focus on climate change now for many years through its National Climate Change Strategy and has made real commitments under the UN Convention on Climate Change. And I don't think most people actually realize this, but Mexico is probably one of the few countries in the world that actually has a climate change law, a national climate change law directing legal action to address this serious issue. It has these kind of aspirational goals of 30% reductions by 2020 and 50% by 2050, and that's in a growing economic environment. So, first of all, I guess my first question is, how is it even possible that a country like Mexico could enact such a law? Where did that political will come from, where we're seeing the challenges of political will, as Peter just noted? And the second sort of part of that question is, what does it mean in practice on the ground today? What do you think is actually happening? How will it get us to that 50% reduction by 2050 goal?
Well, first, I must say that we are feeling the climate change effects every day. So our communities are very sensitive to this problem. And also the Congress is also involved in the solution of the climate change issue. It's not the case in the US. So that's why the Mexican position in the convention is to face this in a legal way first, I mean with the mandate of the Congress. So we are going to the convention meetings, to the COPs, with this mandate from the senators, from the deputies, and we are talking about the solution from the ground. I mean, we are talking about that the people is involved in the solutions, and not it's not at the ambassador position that are dealing with particular documents in the international arena. No, they have to meet some specific goals in the negotiations. What are the goals that we are looking for just to reach this 50% reduction? Well, we must use new instruments, new tools that we have to face this problem. Like, let me talk about different approaches to these solutions. First, we need to close the cycle of carbon. We need to use the life cycle assessment to promote actions that really reduce the emissions. Because in many sense, these carbon initiatives, these carbon markets initiatives, the mitigation actions are reducing direct emissions, but not are reducing in some sense the emissions at all in the world. I mean, if you are very stringent in California. Many companies will migrate or will go to other countries that don't have these standards. And let me tell you that Mexico is receiving million second-hand cars from the U.S. market, and that's carbon leakage. Yeah. So if we will face this problem in a global way, we need to assure that everybody in the carbon cycle is acting with the same goal. This is a tool that we need to use in the carbon market, and we need to use in our policies and our mitigation actions. Otherwise, we are creating this cockroach effect. No, they are moving away from the stringent governments. So the other thing is that we need to introduce another actors of this climate change problem, like short-lived climate pollutants. Even we have the regulations to tackle black carbon. We have the regulations to control F-gases, to change the way we have these air conditioning systems, and how we produce energy also without emitting not only greenhouse gases, but also ozone precursors, or many other short-lived climate pollutants. So we have the science to say that it is possible to control pollutants that will affect us in the short term, trying to, or in the goal to avoid the tipping point of the climate change. And if we succeed in this goal, we can talk about 2050. Otherwise, in 2030, we will face a tipping point of the climate, and we will there will be no way to return to the climate that we used to know in the last century or at the beginning of this century. So we have that mandate in our law, in the Mexican law. We introduced this concept in the law. Now we are building a systematic approach to tackle climate change and to avoid the effects of the climate change in our ecosystems, in our people. We need more resilient communities for sure, but we need to have mitigation actions, or we need to promote mitigation actions with the sense of the urgency that we have. We need to increase our ambition, but not only in greenhouse gases, but also in short-lived climate pollutants. And as I said at the beginning of this little speech, we need to close the carbon cycle in any step that we take to tackle climate change.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's remarkable to me that 1 million cars from the United States, secondhand cars, end up in Mexico. It's, if we were talking about cleaning and the policies that we have, and we're going to turn to Hector next here in California, but if that's just driving those cars across the border, we're not truly addressing it, and I think that's an excellent, excellent point. So we're honored to have Hector De La Torre here today to be representing the state of California and the California Air Resources Board. He's a member of that board and formerly served in the California Assembly for 6 years from South Los Angeles region in our backyard at the Climate Action Reserve. So thank you for coming, first of all. But let me ask you this question as a kind of to open the conversation. So the ARB recently released an update to its scoping plan that shows that there's a need for an interim reduction goal. As Rodolfo just points out, we're looking at 2030 as kind of, we got to get 2030 because we can't, we don't get that, we're not going to get 2050 and the world's going to be in a place. So they've talked about a need for an interim reduction goal for 2030. And it starts to set a pathway for 2050. So maybe you can just talk to us a little bit about the scoping plan and whether you think it might be able to achieve the kinds of aggressive targets that we have in state policy, this 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And where do you think in that, as you're giving us that kind of overview of the scoping plan, where do you think in that are the areas of the biggest challenge or the kind of black boxes that we just don't know what we have out there and how we're going to get there?
I think the setting the table on this is the fact that CARB and California has made incredible progress over the last 20, 30, any metric that you use since its existence. We've made so much progress on any number of fronts. Growing up in Southern California, I can remember playing sports outside, and you would come in after running, doing whatever, and you would have this burning in your lungs because we had so many red alert days in Southern California. Well, in the most recent year that's recorded in Southern California, we've had less than 10 days that are red alerts, the high polluting days. That's incredible progress from over 100 days a year to under 10. That's incredible, phenomenal progress. I can cite any number of other measures of our progress over these years. The energy efficiency in California is tremendous progress in that area. NOx, all the criteria pollutants down dramatically. So we have made all of these strides at the same time that our economy continues to grow. Our GDP from 1990 to 2010 grew 70% in that 20-year period. So we have shown that they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that's, as we move forward, that's where we're going to go. We're going to continue to make incredible strides on air quality, on greenhouse gas reduction, and we're going to continue to grow the economy. That's kind of the mandate that we have going forward. So to your point on the scoping plan, we're expanding the scope of what we're doing under AB 32. We are looking at the energy sector as we have in the past, transportation, but for the first time we're looking at agriculture in depth. We are reaching into the agriculture sector in California. Water, not something we did in the previous scoping plan. The largest consumer of energy in California is moving all this water around from the north to the south, from the east to the west. Waste management is another area that we're going to be looking at in the new scoping plan. Natural and working lands, short-lived climate pollutants that Rodolfo mentioned, and green buildings, energy efficiency. These are all the components of our new scoping plan. And I think from the feedback we've gotten, it's a fairly positive response. Even though we're reaching into these new areas in our economy, we are hearing good things. Obviously, the devil's in the details when we get to actually regulating these things. But we're seeing a very positive response. And clearly, if we're going to get to those 2050 targets, everything has to be on the table. And I think that's how we're going. In terms of the how we get to 2050, clearly we're going to have to tweak AB 32 a little bit and repackage it for those next 30 years after 2020. And we'll probably have to have some midterm target at some point so that we can measure our progress as we go along. But I think there's a will to do that. I think AB 32 in California has embedded itself as policy that is a given in California. It was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger, passed by a Democratic legislature. I voted for it. And so I think at this point, we're so far along in implementation that it's just a given in California. So now it's a matter of how do we get to the major challenge. And I'm going to go a little analog on you. We were told not to bring slides or anything, but I just think this shows it all. And I'm sure you all can see this. This is where we're at in all of our emissions and GHG emissions. this is where we have to go.
It's dramatic. Yep.
So two pictures are worth 1,000 words. I think when I saw that the first time, I thought, wow, how are we going to do that? So now we're actually in the planning stages of how we move down that path to make that happen. And I think there's absolutely a commitment on the part of CARB, certainly on the part of the governor, I think on the part of the legislature, having been there as well. And we'll just work with other folks to make sure that whatever we do, other folks can see what we're doing, and hopefully others can follow.
And of course, I grew up in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s as well, probably a decade at least before you, but experienced that same sort of air pollution issue and talked about, and I recognize the kind of progress we've made, but I know we can have these kinds of achievements. But I don't want to be complacent either. I'm not always so sanguine that there aren't political forces out there that are looking to undermine our achievements and looking to protect, as Peter points out, some of their own interests. And so, I'll get to to Dirk in a second here, but I do have a specific follow-up question for you, Hector, which is, do you see in California, despite our tremendous progress, despite what appears to be now a well-functioning market moving forward, lots of other complementary policies that have been effective, are there forces out there that are still working to undermine AB 32's goals and the market itself, and how is the Air Board addressing or looking at those forces, and what do you think the tension lies in terms of the hardest sectors to get to in terms of emission reductions, and are those the ones that are actually sort of holding on most firmly?
Well, the interesting thing is no one takes on the broad AB 32 mandate anymore. We had Proposition 23 to try to undo AB 32. It failed miserably. The voters supported AB 32 and our political commitment here in California. So no one takes it on head on. But we do see components of it being taken on. So LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, is one that we're fighting right now in the courts. But that's nothing new for CARB. I mean, we get sued on everything we do. And so, we know that when we roll something out, it has to be airtight, that the science has to be fantastic, that we can take on any challenger to the underlying assumptions that lead to the policies that we promote. And so it's a phenomenal staff. That's coming from the legislature over to a regulatory agency. That's been my most pleasant surprise, that this incredible staff is out there putting in all this time, effort, incredible brain power to make sure that whatever we're doing, it is airtight, because we know we're going to get sued on the back end. And no matter what we do, we're going to get sued by somebody. And so invariably we win those court fights because that underlying structure is so sound. And so, I think low carbon fuel standard, again, is one that we're fighting right now. But all the major hurdles there, we've won so far as well. And that is obviously the oil and oil refining business out there. And, they'll complain about California, and they'll complain about our market and our regulations. Yet one oil company from Texas just bought 2 refineries in California. So if it's so terrible, why are you doubling down on California? It isn't. It's a great market. We have 30 million cars or something, almost 30 million cars in California, vehicles. And so, they all need gas. And for now, down the road, they're going to need something else. But but it's clear that we have this thriving economy. Again, 70% GDP growth in 20 years. At the same time, we were doing all these phenomenal regulatory pushes in our economy. It works. Hybrid vehicles, 10,000 hybrid vehicles 14 years ago. There's over 500,000 today. It's just an incredible movement in the market, and we're going to keep trying to push the market even as we regulate. And so, we're optimistic. If you catalytic converters, 36 years ago, catalytic converters were introduced into the marketplace. Today, it's just a given, and the amount of pollution that's been reduced just by that one little contraption has had this incredible positive effect in the world. So there's going to be other things like that. We believe that we will find these little things that can really move us forward.
Great. Well, let me turn to our last but certainly one of our preeminent panelists here as well, which is Dirk Forrister. Dirk is the president at the International Emissions Trading Association, an association of companies and others that are interested in promoting the idea of emissions markets for achieving our environmental goals. And he has a history both on the sort of the banking side, having been a managing director at NatSource, and also on the government side, having been in the White House leading the climate change task force back in the Clinton days. So he's been at this for a little while himself. And with that background, Dirk, let me ask you, the government business, do you think that businesses really, truly have internalized the need for the kind of economic transformation that we're talking about, this sort of energy transformation of the total economy, where take a look at the picture that Hector just showed. We're talking a very, very steep slope, and that's going to mean that some of the industries here today won't be here tomorrow, because just as we don't have people who service phone booths because we don't have phone booths anymore, there are disruptions. That's that creative destruction of the economy. So one, have they internalized that? Do businesses recognize the true nature of that sort of creative destruction that needs to happen in the economy, and how are they addressing that? But then sort of as a follow-up, given your role at the at AIDA, do you think that trading programs in environmental markets is always going to be the right policy tool to get to those kinds of deep reductions, or are we going to have to look at other ways?
So I guess the answer on the business front is that I do think that on this issue, since I've been working on it, business has moved way ahead of where politicians tend to be on it. Maybe not in California, but politicians at a national level in the United States. And I'm with an international group, so I also deal with governments in other parts of the world, and I think that holds in a lot of other places. Not everywhere. There's still places that the business community is trying to put on the brakes or throw sand in the gears. And I think even here in the U.S., my sense is that compared with where it was when I was at the White House, business has moved far ahead and recognizes Peter's point that they're going to pay one way or the other. They're either going to pay to reduce their emissions, or they're going to have to adapt. And the price tag for adapting your energy infrastructure to withstand some of the shocks of an uncontrolled climate, completely out of control climate, are substantial. So I think actually many of them are moving to the vantage point of, yeah, we've got to be a part of a solution on this. We've got to be a part of a pretty dramatic change in energy infrastructure. I'm taken with how in European circles, I'm based in Switzerland now, and I'll go to a conference in Europe where European Commission recently announced their proposed policy for Europe for 2030, so the period in 2020 to 2030. And it is a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases. And business doesn't scream, and they don't get up and run out of the room. And it's pretty amazing that they sort of recognize, yeah, well, 40, that's probably the minimum of what we'd be expected to do. Those in the emission trading sectors are expected to do more than that, I think more like 43%. But that's also Europe's kind of opening bid for the Paris talks for next year. And they've got to work through a political process, but they've made clear if there was actually a market-based system globally that connected up, they could do more than that. And I think that's where my members are, is a belief that, well, we kind of take policymakers at their word that that 2-degree limitation is meaningful, and that the developed world is going to be doing 80%, which is what your chart was about, 80% over the period between now and 2050 in developed world. So I think that they recognize that they need to figure out a policy solution to this that draws everyone in. You can't solve it a state at a time. We need a national law in this country. We need an international treaty architecture that inspires others to step up to the plate and have meaningful contributions to the climate issue. And I guess for my organization, we do think that many countries are going to choose a market-based solution. Not all of them. I mean, there's not much of an indication right now that Bolivia or Venezuela or Cuba are really interested in a market. They want to just regulate, and they would like to regulate in the U.S. too if they were given the authority to do so. But they're not. So it's going to need to be an incentive-based system. And I think the most encouraging thing out there that my institution's been working on is the pilot programs in China. Emission trading in a Chinese style, that the targets aren't uber strict just yet, but they are getting the basics down of how it's going to work in a Chinese context, and 5 of the 7 pilots are up and running. If you add up the 7 pilots and the populations covered by those provinces and cities, it's not too shabby. It is 250 million people covered by those jurisdictions. That's a pilot Chinese style. But it's serious, and I think it's going to grow more serious over the coming years. And of course, the real game there is that they want to go to a national program that could well be some mix of fiscal instruments and emissions trading. But I would say right now, for most of the big sectors, like are covered here in California, they're probably going to be in a similar kind of a model in China. And they're going to be dealing with China's rapid growth, and they're going to be dealing with China's local air quality problems, where when I was there recently, they asked me a question about, can you really, people are wearing masks while I was there, because I was there one of those terrible days, and average people just wonder, can it really be done? Can you really clean this up? And of course it can, right? You've done it here. It can be done. But to get to that scale, Gary, I guess my remark is we've got to have everybody playing in it. Everybody's got to be doing a serious share, and that, in fact, it'll cost us all less if it's integrated and linked up, in at least amongst the countries that want to use markets. I'm hopeful that in this part of the world, that example of what's happening between California and Quebec is sort of a sign of what could happen in the future involving a broader set of players in North America, including down south of here, because I think that could really offer a very constructive model for the rest of the world to look at, and for our nation to look at for some inspiration.
So I'm hearing here a common theme about political will. Peter certainly raised that question: where does the political will come from? And we've got it obviously in California, despite perhaps some detractors, but on the margins perhaps. And Mexico has the political will. China seems to have the political will. Quebec, of course. Yesterday we had folks from Oregon and Washington up here. There seems to be some will there as well. So we're seeing this build. But I guess the question is, we've got a good, I failed to mention Europe. Of course, Europe's had the political will and the leadership for a long time. But my question really, and it's for the panel here, and I want to get everyone's sort of sense of this, is we have these sort of efforts going on, and it feels almost like a ground-up strategy that we no longer have the Kyoto Protocol that's going to drive action from an international scale. And is that sustainable? Is that going to help? Is that actually going to get us to this significant 80% goal, where you have, if to borrow another term, a coalition of the willing? You have nations and states that are willing to go forward, but there's certainly plenty of nations and states that are still not willing to go forward. And one of the biggest, and I'd be curious, Dirk, what you would say about what's going on in India and whether India is also looking at piloting some projects. So that's the first question. Is this ground-up coalition of the willing sufficient to get us to the kind of transformation that we need? And if it's not, what is our political strategy to get the others along? And how do we get there? So I'll throw that out. Maybe, Peter, start with you. But I want everyone to kind of comment on this.
Sure. Well, a couple thoughts. One is, I don't think political will is a yes-no. We have political will to get us forward in some places, but do we actually have the political will even now, frankly, anywhere to get to what we actually need is essentially a decarbonized world within a generation? Right. That's a very different question. And so I say that yes, we've got some progress, but we have a long way to go. I gave a talk at a big summit in India, and everyone was talking enthusiastically about energy efficiency and clean energy. And then one of the ministers stood up and said, we have 300 million people in India with no electricity at all. They just want energy of any sort. Right. And it was, it was a good reminder that the rest of the world is in a very different place. And I think that is something, and I don't mean to be a downer, but we have to be careful drawing too much from the California experience for a couple reasons. If you look at the California economy, in a sense, California has exported its polluting industries. I would bet everything we're wearing was manufactured in China. And half the chairs and all this other stuff was manufactured in China. So all that pollution that we think of as China's is actually California's pollution. And if we were including the pollution from all the manufacturing of all the stuff we use, we would not be in this, the curve wouldn't be even beginning to head down. And so I think we really have to think a little more broadly about where that is. And there's two lessons from that. One is we have to, I think in the US, take much more seriously our supply chain obligations. All of that stuff that we buy. Right now, I think by and large US companies, we're willing to say a little bit about, we care about our supply chain. Some are concerned about their brand. But are they really demanding the same levels of performance throughout their supply chain, wherever they may be, that they would be here? No. And if they're not, then when we thump our chest and feel so great about progress here, are we really being honest? Yeah. I do think there's also, frankly, you have to ask the question of consumption. If you think about the 7 growing to 9 billion people, even the most optimistic technological scenarios, if they were all to have the lifestyle of all of us in California, the math just doesn't add up. Right. And we want to think that we can get there without any change of consumption, but it's pretty unclear that that's possible. The good news is, frankly, many of us in our lives feel that our stuff is too much stuff and making our life less good, but people in Africa and India are certainly not at that end of the spectrum. And they very much want more consumption. I think there's another issue that we have to think about is that in other parts of the world, think about in Africa where wood stoves are a big part of the challenge. I spoke yesterday about agriculture. The way a cow is grown in sub-Saharan Africa, eating very poor, dry forage, actually ends up being far more polluting than even a cow in the U.S. And so the solutions that we're talking about here, they're good, but it is not obvious that they can be quite so quickly exported to parts of the world that are just very, very different. So I think all of this just says that, from my perspective, that we have to be working, frankly, ever harder to build deep enough and broad enough political will for the range of changes that we need to face, and we also need to take responsibility for our impact wherever it is around the world.
Yeah. Rodolfo, absolutely.
Oh, yes. Well, Peter, I agree with Peter because 2 weeks ago we had a meeting with all the Latin American countries, with the ministers of environment of all the Latin American and Caribbean countries, and we were talking about how we can contribute to the convention process, because the next COP is in Peru, in Lima, this year, and in 2 years in Paris, we must reach an agreement just to have some kind of a different arrangement of things, talking about climate change and talking about the reduction strategies that we are foreseeing. So now we have a new paradigm. I mean, the countries in Latin America are not looking the supply of electricity by any means. They want clean energy in their countries. So now we are thinking that it is possible to reach an agreement, because we are not seeing, of course we have coal, we have oil, we have gas, but we are not seeing our future based on fossil fuels. Now we are seeing that we can have some kind of an organic agricultural change production. No, we can have clean energy in our countries. We can have clean vehicles like you are inventing here. Now we can have or clean transportation or sustainable transportation. We can walk. No, because in the American way of life, you don't walk. No. If you go to Miami, where my wife is from, you don't see people walking. No, it's too hot. No, but if you go to Brazil or to Africa, you will see a lot of people walking. Not because they want it, it's because they don't have enough money to buy a car. No, but that kind of things are changing in the mind of the politicians in Latin America. At least, they want to see their cities as a walking cities, sustainable cities, green cities with green buildings, and that's the power of the ideas and the power of the politicians. That when you see that the politicians are looking at a different future, they will reach an agreement to reach that also this goal. So I'm very positive on that, because I'm seeing in the political arena that the people is changing their basic ideas and the idealistic or development that they are looking for.
That's great.
Well, within the United States, I think there's a couple of interesting things outside of California. One is in 2010, as of 2010, 12 states were below their 1990 carbon emissions. So if they had an AB 32, they would have complied. Part of that is because of the economic downturn. Part of it is the transition from coal to natural gas electricity. But that's a phenomenal number that kind of by accident, just the market forces and what was going on in the country allowed them to hit that target. We didn't. We're still on the kind of middle part, trying to bring the curve down till 2020. So that's fascinating. The other, in terms of political will, when we started with AB 32 and the Western Climate Initiative, there were 7 states, American states, and 4 Canadian provinces that were at the table. Because of the economic downturn and other issues, by the time it got to the point where we actually had to do something, it was us in Quebec. So we, along the way, lost some folks. We're hoping to get them back at some point. But maybe it's not a full package. Maybe it's some components of it. Maybe we, the political will isn't there to do a full cap and trade program with California, but some components of it. Maybe it's a RGGI type arrangement. Who knows? And so we're having those kinds of conversations now with folks, with other countries as well, where, you know, let's figure out how we can work together. It doesn't have to be California style. It can be whatever fits for those countries.
We must remember that we are looking at global carbon market. Now we have this bilateral or these local carbon markets or regional carbon markets because it is not feasible to reach this global carbon market. But the final solution of this problem from the market side or approach is the global carbon market. No?
That sounds like a good lead into Dirk.
You know, I think the only thing I would, because I think that is the vision of where it ultimately needs to go, because that is the incentive-based system that attracts business in as a partner in the effort, rather than resisting and worrying about heavy regulation or something. But obviously in the U.S., we're going to try a few other alternatives. We're going to do it piecemeal for a bit. We're going to work on power plant regulations and see whether those regulations can allow for state-based flexibility or not. My hope is that it will. But I actually think that to this session's goal about 2050, I don't see how you sort of like do a work around the political problem here in the U.S. Ultimately, all of us have a role in trying to bring more perspective to that. Because my sense is right now, it's not as much a business versus the enviros problem. There's a few businesses that fund some think tanks that kind of skew the debate. And it really is, and I've seen research on this, really does feel like it's more of an ideological divide that's created an impossibility for a Republican to admit that climate change might be for real if they have national aspirations. That's really weird. That's really weird, because what that really means, again, back to Peter's point, that really means that they're in favor of adaptation. They're willing to bet the farm that we can adapt at a low cost. And that is a huge risk to take on. And for that political party to take on that risk, I'm shocked that, because I don't see it other parts of the world. The UK Conservative Party tried to out-green the other parties when it got elected because, yeah, we can do it smarter, we can do it better. And that's somehow where we have to get to in this country is, let's have both parties talking about how we can do it smarter and do it better. So I do hope that maybe in the course of the next political cycle, we can find a way so that it's not as driven by ideology, but that there's actually some pragmatic problem solving that can emerge that can deliver that world that Rodolfo is talking about. Because the last thing I was going to say is the other thing that I go to these negotiations, as you do, and I find it really hard to see how anything comes together without the U.S. actually stepping into a leadership role. And the U.S. does a great job at these negotiations. We have a very skilled team, but you feel like they're sort of fighting with one hand tied behind their back, that they're not really able to go in with a cohesive national voice about what we want and what we think we could help lead the world on, and how American business can be a part of a global solution to this, and how they can build partnerships with companies in other places and do this in a way that, the cool part about this is you get to rebuild the world's energy infrastructure, and somebody's going to get to make money doing that. We're not going to do it for free, but somebody's going to get to make a lot of money doing that. Right now, it looks like China will be that country that's going to make a lot of money doing it because, I don't know, I see a lot of signs that they're stepping out and further into the lead than U.S. is, at least in terms of having a national game plan. Wow. So we all got to work on that.
Well, yes, just talking about adaptation, how we can incorporate the adaptation side or dimension in these markets or in these agreements. Well, adaptation needs technology. No? If you want to adapt your cities, you need real buildings, but you need different infrastructure, and you must you must create technology to be resilient. So it is a challenge to incorporate this dimension in the markets because we are talking about investments, we are talking about different assets, perhaps resilient assets instead of carbon assets. So it is possible to see that in the future we will have a very or a more complex markets at global level, including the adaptation strategies.
Peter, you had a comment as well.
Well, one is that one of the challenges with adaptation is it almost certainly will significantly exacerbate global inequality, and that there are some places that can adapt and many places that physically can't adapt. If you have a whole country that's almost at sea level or huge areas of your country that are at sea level, you can't put seawalls around them. We could deal with that maybe in San Francisco or New York City, but when the sub-Saharan desert expands, there's just not a whole bunch you can do. So I think which is why the U.S. military is so concerned about climate change, because they see climate change as a major force for destabilizing. You heard a little bit about that on the film yesterday. The other thing, going back to the concept of political will, I think, it's important to understand that at least and we and many others do a lot of polling on these issues, and there is the public will out there. We poll in red states and in blue states. We poll Republicans and Democrats, and there is a lot of understanding, more than you would be led to believe, and a lot of recognition that we need to move forward. That this country's history and progress all around the world has been built by looking forward, not by clinging to the past. The Latino vote routinely is very, very positive, and they're an important demographic. Often, frankly, 20% stronger than Anglos in this country in terms of wanting real action. So the public will is there. It's the political will that isn't. And that goes back to what some people were talking about yesterday, that right now we really do have a disconnect between where the public is and where some segment of our political leaders are. So we shouldn't think that just because some of our political leaders, as you were saying, the leadership of one of our major parties is not pushing us in this direction, we shouldn't think that there's actually that broad public support. Our challenge then is, how do you take this very broad public support and convert that into political action? Right. And we've got some political systematic challenges there. But again, my message is always, that's why we all have to be actively engaged in it. But we shouldn't lose the fact that the public support is there, and figure out how to draw and make clear that our political leaders are not, in fact, representing the people they're paid to elect, to represent.
Right. So I'm going to, invite people to come up to the microphone, because we've got just a little bit of time left here, and I want to make sure the audience has a chance to ask its questions. And as people are doing that, I'm going to take a page out of Terry Tamanen's book when he moderates panels for us, and he does something that he calls the lightning round. And I'm only going to ask one question, and I'm looking for a very short, 1 minute or less response from each of our panelists. And so playing off of this idea that there is public support, and we have to recognize that there's this life cycle supply chain effect from what we do, and we need to address consumption. I'm going to go in a completely different direction than I may have otherwise. I'm going to ask you about your personal lives and tell me one thing that you've done in your own personal life to address climate change, and have you encouraged others to take that same action? And I'm going to start this side. I'm going to go the other direction.
So the big thing I did was I moved from Colorado to Switzerland, so I didn't have to drive anymore. But that probably is a little extreme. But I do walk. I do walk to work, but I'm fortunate enough to live close enough that that's a feasible option. But I do highly recommend it.
And you recommend people move to Switzerland? All right. Yeah. Thank you.
I would say I do a lot of little things. you know, my car is very small. It's a gas vehicle, but it's a small, good gas mileage. I'm very focused on recycling. Personally, in my home with my kids, I'm always badgering them about recycling. Water efficiency in Southern California is a big deal. We're very, very careful about water. And energy efficiency in the home as well. We've swapped everything out, you know, done all the usual tricks for the home to be as energy efficient as possible. So I haven't done anything dramatic, but I think all of these little things are what we're all supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
I have a carbon diet. No, in my home, in my personal life, I commit a lot of sins. No, my wife saw the shower here and said, "This is a real shower, not the one we have at home." So they complain a lot, but we are trying to reduce our carbon footprint in our home. That's the way we do it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We, as a family, stopped eating beef. And if you actually look at one's personal footprint, generally speaking, what you eat makes a huge difference. And simply, I mentioned this yesterday, shifting even from beef to chicken, will probably be the single greatest thing most people can do. At NRDC, we did an analysis of our carbon footprint. 80% of NRDC's carbon footprint is flying. So frankly, we have, at the office, really trying to be vamping up our video conferencing. It's hard. I'm going to be flying back to New York tonight, so I'm not doing so great on that. But video conferencing and trying to fly less is another thing that can make a big difference. It also makes your life a lot better.
Absolutely.
And by the way, eating less beef probably makes you healthier too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, and sorry to put you all on the spot on your own personal lives. We've got questions here.
Good morning. I'm Liz Nissen. I'm with the Clean Air Board in San Francisco. My question is about China, and I know you addressed it briefly. I was there last fall. I was absolutely horrified by the amount of coal, and we were essentially moving quickly from place to place. Seldom did I not see a coal billow going into the sky, and seldom did I see the sun in 10 or 12 days. Comments?
You're right. It's a challenge. NRDC has an office in China, and we are working hard. We are beginning now. There's some real interest in trying to put a cap on coal consumption in China. There's actually beginning to have the similar discussion, although at an earlier stage in India. But the growth of coal-fired generation in China over the last decades has been tremendous. And it's not only a global warming challenge, but it is a big driver in the local air pollution. Yeah. The good part of that is that the pollution now is ever more visible, ever more apparent, causing a lot of political interest and at times public unrest. And so the government is beginning to even more, they had been looking at energy issues for a long time and been very interested particularly in, as you were saying, clean energy and energy efficiency, but their interest is ramping up as the pollution becomes ever more severe.
And it's had an economic impact as well, where you have foreign nationals who would come and manage a factory or you know do something productive in China who refuse to go. Who just don't want to go there because of the pollution. They don't want to take their families there and put them at risk either. So it's had an economic effect in that this foreign direct investment that they've taken for granted is at risk because there's no one willing to come to run things for these foreign corporations.
It's interesting to me that as they respond to this air pollution problem, particularly with the steel mills and the power plants and chemical production, it seems like they're doing kind of the opposite of what we're doing. We're getting a lot of these reductions that were referenced, that Hector referenced on the back of other pollution regulations from mercury and NOx and sulfur standards that are tightening down, and people know carbon is coming. And so you're seeing the power sector here start to transform itself, driven by the local air quality benefits. And in China, my sense is they're going to go after the carbon because they know at the same time they'll get the benefits on local air quality. And in the last meetings I was in there at the end of February, almost every meeting started with a government official apologizing for the air. It is right at the tip of the consciousness. So I think something's going to change.
Yes, they are trying to solve the problem, and they don't have the ways we have to solve problems. They are not waiting for a market signed. They are waiting for a political decision. And with this collective mind they have, I'm sure that in the near future they will solve the problem just like this. I hope so. Yeah.
Hello, I'm David Wright. I'm with Plains All-American Pipeline, but I'm speaking as an individual here. I happen to be a Republican. I happen to have worked in the petroleum business for 45 years. I do believe in global warming, but I think some of the public policies, particularly here in California, do not work. We should be able to take the resources that we spend to try to deal with pollution, and particularly in carbon, and spend them anywhere and get a lot more mileage out of the money we spend to eliminate carbon than we do trying to address the AB 32 problem the way we are. Good example on the low carbon fuel standards. People are exporting ethanol to Brazil to get Brazilian ethanol to bring to California. It makes no sense whatsoever, but that's the kind of things that happen to try to meet these regulations. If we could take the $20 or $30 million you need to spend on a refinery here and spend it on capturing methane up in North Dakota that they're flaring and leaking all over the place as they drill the state out, the world will be 10 times better off than what we are trying to achieve the goals in California. So, Hector, I think the message back to the board is you need to globalize now. You know, we can't wait.
We try. We try, and then we get accused by folks of not being California-centric enough in terms of some of the things we do. Some of the offsets that we have are not in California, and we have, folks, legislators, others, complaining to us that we're not getting the benefit here in California, and so that's an ongoing tension that we have. We want to be able to do stuff on a macro level that will give us a good bang for our buck worldwide, but our jurisdiction is California, and our mandate is in California. Our political push is in California, so we have to be very responsive here. So that's just a constant tension that we have.
I would just say that's an obvious reason why we need, ideally, a federal program. If we had a federal AB 32, it would be a lot better off, and if we had a global AB 32, it would be better off still. And until we do, there will be inevitable inefficiencies. And I think many of us believe we got to be moving forward, and the inefficiencies are essentially something you have to swallow now while we're moving towards a better and more comprehensive system. But we certainly would agree that a broader coverage, as I said, if we had a nationwide AB 32, which we believe is what's going to be required, and then global, is absolutely the way to go.
So I apologize, though. I think we're about out of time here. So I think you'll have an opportunity to talk to the panelists afterwards. I did see there was one last question, but I want to just thank our panelists today for what I thought was a really interesting, illuminating, sometimes optimistic and sometimes not, conversation about how we get to 2050 and whether we can get to 2050. And I think it is particularly interesting to turn that question on its head, and I think Dirk did that very well when he said that there are those who are betting that we can adapt our way out of this and are willing to spend their money that way in the future. And I don't know that that's the right approach, and I hope that's not the approach we take. I hope we do exactly as Mr. Wright suggests, and we globalize this, this solution as quickly as possible. So let me start by giving a hand to everybody here.